Senator Scott Ludlam here, and the great pleasure of having Julian Assange, Julian's mum, here. Scott's going to talk on issues surrounding WikiLeaks and the war on the internet. Christine's going to be available to answer questions on that, and Adam Stone, our candidate for Mount Cootha, would like to make some comments about wild rivers. Okay. And I'll take any other questions that people
Where's your
might have.
little girl? That's what I want to know. Why don't you
She's
ever
at
bring her?
home.
I want to see
Didn't have
her.
any comments.
She's loud and she'll steal the limelight.
What is she,
She's
2?
gorgeous. Almost 3.
Right, now we've got some important
Scott,
stuff out of the way.
Take it away.
Okay. Well, firstly, thanks very much for coming down this afternoon for our forum. This is the third that we've done like this. We've had packed houses in Sydney and Melbourne, and we're gauging the sentiment of the Australian population around support for Julian Assange and for the publishing organisation WikiLeaks and its staff. This is a profoundly important organisation. They have done enormously important work in exposing things that people in power and government and large corporations would prefer were kept secret, and now they're under sustained attack by the United States government. And our message here, and what we'll be saying at the forum this afternoon, is that our government and our Prime Minister needs to step up now, because it's getting very serious. Any time within the next few days we could hear from the British Supreme Court about whether or not Julian will be extradited to Sweden, and there, if you believe what was released in the Stratfor materials, he could very rapidly be on his way to the United States. It is not acceptable that the Australian government has stayed silent. So we're calling on the Prime Minister to make her position very clear, and on the new Foreign Minister Bob Carr to stick up for an Australian citizen in trouble.
Is that what you want them to do? Stick up for him? You want them to intervene at a diplomatic level?
We do. So we saw when a kid was busted in Bali for possession of quantities of marijuana, people were put on planes, phones rang. The Australian government appropriately did everything that it could to make sure his legal and consular rights were upheld. Now, in the case of an Australian journalist who has got on the wrong side of the US government, nothing, not a word, and that has to stop. The Australian government needs to stand up for him. That means legal, diplomatic and political pressure now.
And so what would you hope that they would be able to achieve? Julian's return to Australia? He probably doesn't want to come here.
No, I think his return to Australia would be appropriate. That's up to him. The Australian government needs to ask him what kind of support he requires and what kind of support he needs at this stage. We can't even get from the Australian government, through questions in Parliament and through 6 Freedom of Information requests, whether they knew about the existence of the sealed indictment that apparently was signed at least a year ago. They won't tell us whether they know or whether they care, and that's really concerning.
If Julian Assange is going to stand for the Senate, presumably he would need to be returned to Australia.
I don't know that that's necessarily the case. He'd need to be back in the country to sit in the chamber if he won his seat. But I think it actually is possible to campaign, excuse me, I think it would be possible for Julian to campaign in absentia, but that would presume that he's under house arrest somewhere or in detention, and I think that would be really alarming if by this time next year that's the case.
So you've been gauging the level of support amongst your members and supporters.
Yeah.
What is it?
I think there is huge support in the Australian community for Julian and his work, and the work of WikiLeaks. We don't like being bullied by the United States government, and we would like to see the Australian government step up for him. I think the Prime Minister, if she thinks she can just keep her head down and stay silent, is really badly mistaken. There's a huge amount of support in Australia for him.
So how would you see him standing? Would he stand as a candidate for the Greens?
Not necessarily. I found this out about an hour ago, so this is an announcement that organisation has made, and his decisions are up to him. What I will say is good on him, the more the better. And if it brings these issues to the fore and back onto the front pages again, we will all be better off for it.
Can he stand as a candidate for WikiLeaks? Is it a political party? Do you have to be a political party?
I'd probably let the organisation take those questions. They would need to register formally with the Electoral Commission, as we all do, but I'll let them field those questions.
Okay, perhaps I'll ask Christine a question if I may.
Right.
Wouldn't it be rather dull for your son to sit in the Australian Senate day in, day out?
Well, if anyone was to watch Scott's performance in the Australian Senate, it would be anything but dull. And the more people that we have in there that are interested in transparency and operating this government as a democracy, the better.
So you've spoken to your son about this idea of standing for the Senate?
I've just heard about it myself, and I don't think that's really the most important issue at the moment. I know that it was announced today, but the more the important issue is the cross-border collusion between America, Sweden, UK and Australia to silence a journalist and a media organisation which is merely doing their job by telling the people what's going on in the corridors of power.
So in spite of perhaps widespread support for his activities, it's another thing to get people to vote for him on an election ballot paper. What would be the purpose, the real purpose of his candidacy? To raise certain issues?
Oh, you'll have to speak to Julian about that. I'm not going to speak for him. But just to say that I've had a number of people say to me that they're so disillusioned with the Labor Party and the Liberal Party not backing the Greens and standing up for transparency and democracy and a sovereign state Australia, that we're becoming just an annexure of the US, that they are willing to stand as independents. And these are good candidates, Supreme Court barristers, journalists and other solicitors, ordinary citizens. They're just so disillusioned with this bipartisan support for cracking down on an Australian journalist and democracy in general, that they're putting their names forward, and it's all in flux at the moment as to who's going to stand for who.
The Senate should be an ideal place for independent thinkers, but that's not really what it's become in this country over the years, has it?
Well, it would appear not. Scott put forward a motion to the Senate to try and protect Julian from a little-known escape clause for a bilateral treaty, within a bilateral treaty between Sweden and the US, where Julian could be rendered immediately through the conditional release temporary surrender regime, which the media hasn't reported on, actually. People think there's protections under the onward rendition from Sweden by having to get permission from the UK, but that's not true. Sweden has never stopped an extradition from its own soil to the US, and this particular treaty is very dangerous, and Julian could be picked up without any kind of proper due process and taken to the US. And Scott wanted to bring to attention this to the Senate and asked that at the very least all parties agree that be stopped, and it was blocked by Liberal Party.
How anxious are you that his current appeal won't be successful?
I can't, even if it's successful, Karen, there's still terrible things on the agenda. At the moment, David Cameron is over there in the US, cozying up to Obama, talking about redressing the imbalance with the UK-US treaty, but only for UK citizens. Now that's a treaty which people also are very aware of in Australia, where no prima facie case is allowed to extradite someone from the UK. You aren't even allowed. The US is not. The US doesn't have to present a prima facie case. In other words, evidence that its case has got any basis. So he could be extradited from the UK at any moment. Also in Australia, we've got synchronicity with the US in regard to relaxing extradition laws. The National Defence Authorisation Act went through on New Year's Eve, which allowed indefinite detention of US citizens without warrant. That was the day before the changes to the extradition 1988 Extradition Act in Australia, which was snuck through under the media hype of the leadership spill, and that relaxes all the protections for people being extradited to the US. Now, the fact that there's been 24-hour synchronicity on this is a great concern.
Okay, back to Scott then, about what you have done in the Senate to try to protect Julian.
Well, we've taken the opportunity to use some of the tools that we have in the chamber around motions and asking direct questions of ministers. And I must say, after a year of doing that, I'm more concerned than I was before I started, because we're hearing total silence. The Australian government has done the absolute bare minimum above stuff all to help this Australian citizen in trouble. And that makes me more concerned than ever, really. They've attempted to block and delay freedom of information requests. They haven't answered straight questions. They've voted against motions. And to me, it's starting to look not like indifference, but like hostility. And that's about to be put to the test. Whether the senior leadership of the ALP and the Liberal Party feel that their allegiance is to the people who vote for them, or to Washington, that we're about to find out.
Good, thank you.
Thanks.
Anna Adam on Wild Rivers.
I'm aware that Tony Abbott and Campbell Newman and some Pearsons are all gathering in Ashgrove this afternoon, and I suspect I won't get a prize for guessing that they're going to make some sort of statement opposing Wild Rivers. And I actually received a phone call on my way here from a traditional owner up on the Cape, alarmed that the public is going to get the impression that traditional owners up on the Cape don't support this scheme. They do support it, and so do the Greens, and I think it's ridiculous that it's being opposed under the banner of economic opportunity when this scheme employs people as Indigenous Wild River Rangers.
Yeah, there seems to be enough opportunity for people to operate businesses within the Wild Rivers legislation.
That's right. There are very few cases of proposed developments or economic activities being knocked back because of this regime.
Well, mining.
Sorry?
Mining.
There was one that I'm aware of that was knocked back, and that would have been highly destructive to our pristine river system. So it seems to me that we're striking quite a good balance with a scheme that protects our pristine river systems up on the Cape and also provides employment to traditional owners.
That's great.
Thank you.
That's good. Do you want to say anything more, Rita?
No, I'm good,
Everyone
thanks.
else has had a